Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another video today. We will be handling a 2021 pre-free agency NFL mock draft using the PFF mock draft simulator tool, which if you're a fan of any particular team or you just love the draft, I would highly recommend. You can set it to 7 rounds, draft for whatever teams you like, all sorts of different settings for you to mess around with and just kind of have a good time. So shout out to PFF for the awesome tool, but without further ado, let's get into today's mock draft. Okay, before we jump in and start this thing, I do want to mention that I will be drafting kind of from the perspective of what I think the teams will do, not necessarily what I would do or really what I would consider the best fit for those teams. Just kind of trying to find a good mix between fit, best player available, and kind of what I think the teams might be leaning towards as we head closer to the draft. So with that in mind, let's start off with the Jacksonville Jaguars and the number 1 overall pick. Now, I think it goes without question to say that the Jaguars have been pretty terrible over the last 10 to 12 years, maybe even a little bit before then if you count the 2007 season, which was the last legitimate time they made the playoffs, not counting 2017. They're always picking in the top 10. A lot of times they're picking in the top 5, but they've never been quite bad enough to select first overall. And luckily for myself, a Jaguars fan, and Jaguars fans like me, this year we were able to achieve, I guess is a good way to put it, the number 1 pick. And couldn't have been a better year to do it. You take Trevor Lawrence here, no questions asked, and we move on to number 2 with the New York Jets, who I believe should also be targeting a quarterback. I think Sam Darnold, despite not really having a lot going in his favor throughout his career, hasn't shown enough, even considering those things, to warrant kind of betting on him moving forward. If the Jets don't trade this pick for Deshaun Watson, I think they should be targeting a quarterback. And I like Zach Wilson a lot. I think he kind of reminds me of a modern-day Brett Favre, maybe a little less turnover-prone for Jets fans' health. But yeah, I think that's a good fit here. Zach Wilson to the Jets at number 2, which brings us to Miami, who obviously has this pick thanks to the Houston Texans. Maybe this pick goes back to the Houston Texans in a potential Deshaun Watson trade, but we won't know that until it happens. So with that being the case, I think the Dolphins obviously still need help along the offensive line, but I do think that surrounding Tua with a little bit more effective weapons could go a long way in furthering his development, which showed that he still needed that, especially in the back half of last year when the playoff push begins. And I would not necessarily take him here, but I think Devontae Smith, with the hype that he's getting, coming off the Heisman Trophy season, I think he might very well be in tune for a reunion with his old Alabama quarterback. You know, national championship heroes, the both of them against Georgia, with Devontae Smith here at number 3 for the Dolphins. Number 4 to me is probably the most interesting spot in the draft as it sits right now. I think this is a spot prime for a trade down situation where if the Falcons don't decide to move on from Matt Ryan themselves, maybe they can talk themselves in to drafting a quarterback of the future to sit a year behind Matt Ryan, or maybe they decide to trade back, collect a couple assets, and get as many extra picks in this draft as they can to suit up to hopefully be a playoff contender again next year with Matt Ryan under center. But I think if you're picking this highly and you don't have the option to trade back, there's not going to be a chance to get a guy like Justin Fields again if you're the Atlanta Falcons, especially if you keep Matt Ryan around. So I would take Justin Fields here. And even if the Falcons aren't going to be the ones picking at 4, I do think Justin Fields does end up going in this spot regardless of who ends up making the pick, especially if Zach Wilson or Justin Fields, whoever's left over at this point. On to number 5 in the Cincinnati Bengals. This one can't be debated. They have to protect Joe Burrow. He looked amazing last year, even with playing behind one of the worst offensive lines I think I've ever seen. You draft Penei Sewell. You can move Jonah Williams to right tackle. Now you have 2 cornerstone players, and you have enough draft capital still for the rest of the draft to attack the middle of your offensive line, which definitely needs improvement as well. But starting off with somebody as safe as Penei Sewell on the left side is going to be going a long way in protecting Joe Burrow for hopefully the foreseeable future. Next up, we have the Eagles, who with all of their offseason moves have seemed to pretty much solidify the fact that they are tied to Carson Wentz after getting rid of Doug Peterson and bringing in a more Wentz-friendly coach with the quarterback's coach from the Colts. That being the case, I think the Eagles have to do whatever it takes to surround Carson Wentz with the talent around him to kind of make his life easier, because to be honest, it hasn't been easy these past couple of years, both with the offensive line problems and with receivers constantly getting hurt. And even when they are healthy, not playing well. Jamar Chase, in my opinion, is the best wide receiver in this draft, and I think he will go pretty solidly in being that security blanket, kind of just a dude who always has a knack for getting open. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like Antonio Brown in a way, where he's just always seemingly finding spaces in the defense. He's big and strong, really good at the point of the catch. I really think Jamar Chase would make a huge difference in helping turn Carson Wentz's career around, to be completely honest. Next up, we have the Detroit Lions, who are in the process at this moment of getting rid of their franchise quarterback, Matthew Stafford. This is one of the worst rosters on paper heading into 2021. So I think it'll be important to kind of establish a culture for new head coach Dan Campbell. They just hired Mark Brunell to be their quarterbacks coach. That being said, I'm not sure maybe if they'll go quarterback this early, especially since it seems to be the very first steps of a rebuild. Sometimes you like to build the roster around first and then select your quarterback, kind of like the Dolphins did last year with Tua, to be completely honest with you. So I kind of see Micah Parsons being the sort of tone setter in the culture and program that Dan Campbell would like to set up. And so I think that's a perfect fit here with Dan Campbell, Micah Parsons, and we'll see what they can do in the second round and on. But whatever they get out of the Matthew Stafford trade, I think maybe they could flip into a quarterback, but a little too rich for a Trey Lance pick here for my blood. So Micah Parsons makes a ton of sense. Next up, the Carolina Panthers, who luckily for them got to retain Joe Brady this year. He was not poached away by any head coach hungry teams. That being the case, I think you add another weapon to this offense after investing all of your draft picks last year on defensive players. So Kyle Pitts here is going to be a very fun fit that I really like, and I've seen it in a couple of other mock drafts as well. I think there's only a handful of coaches in the NFL who will understand exactly how to use Kyle Pitts to his maximum potential, and I think that Joe Brady is one of them. And I think that with the combination of DJ Moore and Kyle Pitts and Robbie Anderson and Christian McCaffrey getting healthy, whoever does end up being the future at the quarterback position for the Carolina Panthers, whether that be Teddy Bridgewater or someone they draft later in this year's draft, or even someone they decide to maybe hang on until next year, I think they're going to be in a great spot with that receiving core surrounding them. Now we have the Denver Broncos at number 9, with John Elway stepping down as the GM, kind of stepping away from the responsibility that has to offer. I think this team might be looking for a quarterback, especially that the fact that Drew Lock is kind of holding back their evaluations now of some of the young offensive players they have with Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, Alberto, Noah Fant, KJ Hamler. With an inconsistent quarterback, you're never really going to get a chance to evaluate those guys properly. And so I think that bringing in Trey Lance here, getting him under the tutelage of Pat Shurmur, kind of giving that team another avenue, another shot at a franchise quarterback, it makes a ton of sense to me. There's a lot of pieces there that can kind of ease his transition into the NFL. And, if worse comes to worse and he's not ready to start at the very beginning of the season, you could always throw Drew Lock out there for a couple weeks until he gets his feet underneath of him. So really like that pick, and I think that is something that they will be targeting. And if they don't go quarterback there, maybe a corner. Somebody like Caleb Farley would look great in Vic Fangio's defense. But we'll move on to number 10 with the Dallas Cowboys, who I do actually have selecting Caleb Farley, the cornerback out of Virginia Tech. He's going to fit Dan Campbell's Dan Quinn's scheme very nicely. They drafted Trevon Diggs last year, and he struggled mightily, but he also kind of fits the mold of what Dan Quinn looks for in corners, where he's big, athletic, long. He's going to put his hands on receivers, and Caleb Farley kind of brings that added benefit of being a good ball hawking kind of cornerback, where he's going to make plays on the ball, kind of in that Richard Sherman mold in a way, except Farley's a little bit more athletic in that sense. So really like the fit. Kind of think the Cowboys need to just find somebody who will make it so their secondary cannot get lit on fire every week. And if they're bringing Dak back and they shore up that secondary, we're talking about a legitimate playoff force next year in the Dallas Cowboys. Now we have their NFC East rival, the New York Giants, picking at 11. And to me, nobody makes more sense here than Kwity Paye. I know they need help still in different receiver positions, but Kwity Paye kind of fits the mold of the players that they've targeted in recent years in terms of, size, athleticism, the fact that he plays along the defensive line. I think that they continue to try and build from the trenches out, which makes a lot of sense considering Dave Gettleman and Joe Judge's sort of attitude towards those old school football ideals. Kwity Paye is a freak for his size. I believe he was number 1 on Bruce Feldman's freak list last year. So he gives you not only just the flat out size that I know the Giants covet, but he also offers you that athletic upside and, pure edge rushing ability, which, considering what you're going to have to compete with in the NFC East, the Cowboys, and if the Eagles get it turned around and whoever Washington has behind center, it's going to be important to rush the passer, and I think Kwity Paye is a good bet for the New York Giants here. Which brings us to the San Francisco 49ers, who may not have this pick, depending on if they ship it out for a Matthew Stafford or Deshaun Watson, but if they are somehow able to hang on to it and the board falls this way, I don't think there's any way Kyle Shanahan passes up on Jalen Waddle. Just that dimension of speed that he brings to an offense. He's a more complete wide receiver than just speed, than somebody like Henry Ruggs was last year, in my opinion. And to be honest, the hype that Devontae Smith got all this year, I think we would be talking about Jalen Waddle in the same regard if he hadn't gotten hurt. And, we got to see him for a full 2020 college football season with Alabama. I think he's a legit difference maker. You put him on an offense that already has George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, the stable of running backs that they have. And, that's going to be an exciting offense to watch no matter who's playing, even if it's Jimmy G again next year. So shout out to my boy Armand. I definitely hope the chips fall this way for you, my friend. Moving down the coast of Los Angeles, we are heading to the Chargers, who definitely need to address the offensive line. I think the defense will be much improved now that Gus Bradley is no longer in charge, and the fact that they have Brandon Staley in tow. Brandon Staley getting to work with Derwin James and Joey Bosa, and if they can bring Melvin Ingram back, which may not be possible at this point, I really, really like the premise of what they can do, like the theory of what you can see on the defensive side of the ball for LA, which means that protecting Justin Herbert becomes priority number 1. And Rashawn Slater falling to 13 feels like a pretty good value for me for this team. So, he's versatile. He could play inside. He could play outside, depending on where you need him. And that's just the sort of thing that the Chargers need. So Rashawn Slater to the Chargers at 13. Moving on to number 14 and the Minnesota Vikings. If you watched the Vikings at all last year, the most stunning thing, other than their young secondary getting absolutely torched every week and the occasional Kirk Cousins collapse, was the stark lack of a pass rush with Danielle Hunter out. Gregory Rousseau from Miami, who is going to be my selection here for them at number 14, is kind of fits in the perfect mold of the kind of defensive end players that Mike Zimmer has had success with in the past. I think he makes a ton of sense opposite Danielle Hunter. I think that gives you 2 movable pieces along the defensive line, and I think he could go a long way in helping the Vikings defense get back to, levels that they saw before last season when everything sort of fell apart. Next up, we have the New England Patriots at number 15. Obviously, I'm sure their fans would love a wide receiver or a tight end or a quarterback here, but to be completely honest, I don't think Bill Belichick should be trusted to draft wide receivers in the first round. Last time they just desperately drafted a wide receiver in the first round with N'Keal Harry. It did not work out. I think that they should play to their strengths. Maybe, address wide receiver in the later rounds. Since this is such a deep wide receiver draft class, and just kind of hope that you hit on something. And I assume because of the way they kind of tend to do things that they will look for a veteran in free agency to play quarterback. So Jeremiah Owusu-Karamoah from Notre Dame feels like a nice pick here for the Patriots. His question mark on PFF's annual draft guide, which I would highly recommend if you're into this sort of thing, says that his biggest question mark is positional fit. And I think that there's no one that I would rather land with if that was my question mark playing defense than Bill Belichick. I think he'll find perfect ways to use him. And I just think this would be a home run selection for them to rebuilding that defense to, again, just like the Vikings, levels where we saw them dip past in 2020. Next up at 16, we have the Arizona Cardinals. One of the more interesting teams, they kind of to me in no man's land, unless they get more development out of Kyler Murray next year, which hopefully if he stays healthy, he'll be able to continue the nice upward trajectory we saw at the beginning of 2020. They do still have kind of question marks in terms of playmaking on offense, especially now that Larry Fitzgerald has retired. They didn't seem to understand how to use DeAndre Hopkins correctly. I'm going to assume that Cliff Kingsbury works all that out in the offseason and they try and address the defense first, with Patrick Peterson kind of falling off a cliff last year, Byron Murphy being best suited to play in the slot, and Drake Kirkpatrick kind of being, more of a stopgap than anything. I think Patrick Surtain, the second here, he's a legitimate outside corner. He might not be the most athletic guy playing outside corner anymore, but when you look at his technique, when you look at his experience, to me, he's a pretty safe bet to be solid. And in that division, when you're going up against the Rams and Sean McVay, when you're going up against Shanahan and whoever is at quarterback for the 49ers, and when you're going up against Russell Wilson and the Seahawks, you need true, legitimate cornerbacks. And I think Surtain is a safe bet there for the Cardinals. Now we have the Las Vegas Raiders, so a little bit further north up in the desert. Their defense is pretty much single-handedly holding them back right now. I think Christian Barmore will help them in a lot of different ways from Alabama. He is probably the best interior pass rusher in this draft class, and I think not even probably. I think that goes without question, which getting that sort of interior pass rush could go a very long way in helping Oakland's outside pass rush, which has been very, very weak over the basically since Gruden and Mayock took over. Barmore checks the boxes for Gruden and Mayock that he went to Alabama, Clemson, or Ohio State, which they always seem to target early in the draft. So Christian Barmore to Oakland at 17 overall seems like kind of one of those things where need meets kind of the best player available type situation, and they find themselves in a very good spot there. Next up, the Dolphins' second first-round pick. This one, obviously, is their own. They got Devontae Smith earlier in this mock draft, and I think continuing to build up that offensive line and picking Christian Darrisaw out of Virginia Tech makes a lot of sense here. He had a phenomenal 2020 season, phenomenal even 2019 season, but really came on this past season where he just stonewalled every good pass rusher that he faced in the ACC. I think that you could play him at left tackle and move last year's first-round pick, Austin Jackson, over to right tackle. And now we're starting to talk about a very young offensive core in Miami that's going to have the chance to grow and build together, which I really like. Now we have Washington, the football team here at number 19, and I have them selecting Kadarius Toney, the kind of wide receiver gadget player out of Florida. This year he showed he was more than that. He showed that he has the legitimate chops to be a wide receiver. He definitely needs more development in terms of, running routes and just the nuances of the position. But that being the case, him going to a team like Washington where they already have Terry McLaurin in place, it'll take a little bit of the pressure off of him to be a legitimate number one. And, Toney is kind of like exactly what you would want in a very high upside number 2 wide receiver where he can do all sorts of things. He can run whatever you need him to run. You can put him in the backfield. You can hit him on jet sweeps. And I really like to see the sort of young pieces that Washington is putting together on offense to kind of match the, ferocity that we see on their young defense with that defensive line. So I assume they're going to be a team that tries to attack the quarterback position in free agency. So you need to surround whatever quarterback you bring in, whether that's a guy like Cam Newton or somebody else, with as much offensive talent as possible. And right now, just Terry McLaurin is not getting the job done. Now, on to the Chicago Bears. I think that they are a team that Mac Jones makes a ton of sense for. Mac Jones, and more specifically, Matt Nagy, the head coach, has shown a lot of ability to kind of coach well with a high-end game manager type. In 2015, he led a top 5 NFL offense with Alex Smith as his quarterback, and Alex Smith has never been known to be one of the more explosive passers in the league. So I think Jones fits in very nicely here. There's speedy receivers that he was used to playing with this past year at Alabama, with guys like Darnell Mooney and Anthony Miller. Maybe they bring Allen Robinson back, although it looks like he might be looking for greener pastures. But Mac Jones to Chicago, kind of reestablish that, everyone chill out. Let's not turn the ball over. Let's move the ball meticulously, have a quarterback who can read the game and not give the ball to the other team, Mitch Trubisky and Nick Foles, and kind of build from there. I think this makes a ton of sense. Now we have the Colts, who are also obviously in the quarterback market, but kind of like I mentioned with Washington earlier, I assume they'll be more aggressive in free agency trying to find that quarterback. And I know that there's a lot of teams in that camp this offseason, and there's more teams than players. So we'll see how that ends up. But I think that the Colts need to focus on improving their pass rush. Their secondary play overperformed a bit last year. Maybe you could see them going for a safety or corner here. But Jason Owe from Penn State makes a ton of sense to me. He's a freak amongst the class of edges that are all seeming to be freaks at the top end of the draft here. They're a team that I think can figure out how to get him to hone all of those physical tools that he has and get him, productive and as a legitimate cornerstone of their defense as they move forward into the future. Now on to their fellow AFC South team, the Tennessee Titans, whose offense started to click really well last year. They looked pretty good, all things considered, but one thing that stuck out if you watched the Titans last year was their lack of pass rush, and Azeez Ojulari from Georgia is probably about the best pure pass rusher in this draft class, just if you're talking about getting after the quarterback, not really being too good at anything else. I think that he makes a ton of sense for this team to address that specific need. I would really, as a Jags fan, I would hate to see this, but I think with Jeffrey Simmons, if they could bring back even Jadeveon Clowney at a reasonable price, then I think you're talking about three guys who can push the pocket, and I think that just would eventually have to, improve the pass rushing situation at that point in Tennessee. Now we have the Jets' second pick, and I want to make this clear. I would not do this. This is not something I would do, but given the hype that he is getting, and given the need that they have at this position, I think that you could very well see the Jets take Najee Harris here at 23 to go with their new quarterback, Zach Wilson, that we have them taking at number 2. I would not personally take a running back, especially not Najee Harris, in the first round. If I was to take one in this year's draft in the first round, it would probably be Travis Etienne. But I see the line of thinking for a lot of people. I don't necessarily get the Derrick Henry 2.0 comparisons, but Harris can catch. He will be effective out of the backfield. He was very productive in college, all things considered. So it makes sense. I just wouldn't do it. I would not ever draft a running back in the first round. You could probably tell that with all of my affinity for PFF, but I would stay away from this, but I could definitely see it happening. Next up, we have the Steelers, who I have selecting safety Trevon Moehrig out of TCU. Super versatile safety. Think he will play very nicely next to Minkah Fitzpatrick. They're going to lose Mike Hilton in all likelihood to free agency. I think that they can address their offensive line needs in the second and third round because this is a pretty deep class in terms of tackles and interior offensive linemen. So Trevon Moehrig gives them another kind of flexible piece back in the back end, which is their weak point of what is a tremendous defense, especially considering the front seven. But I think you kind of shore up the back end there, and Moehrig and Fitzpatrick kind of roaming the back end. Those are two ball hawks that teams are going to have to account for. Now we have the Jags with their pick that they received from the Rams in the Jalen Ramsey trade. And just like they did last year with their Jalen Ramsey pick from the Rams, when they took C.J. Henderson, I have them taking another long, athletic SEC corner in J.C. Horn. With Sidney Jones and C.J. Henderson already there, Horn would give them 3 very long, very physical safeties who, when you watch the Jags last year, the biggest thing that stuck out was the lack of depth in the secondary. I think you take a cornerback here at 25, and then in the second round, they could address their tackle needs, especially if Cam Robinson is not getting re-signed. And they could even pick up a safety in the second round because again, like interior offensive line, it is a deep safety class in my opinion. So get the corner and the quarterback in the first round where, they're kind of scarce. Reinvest in the offensive line and safety in the second round, and I think the Jags find themselves in a pretty good spot. Next up, the Browns at 26. I have them selecting Missouri linebacker Nick Bolton, who kind of fills the need that they left when Joe Schobert came to Jacksonville, incidentally, last year. They need a leader in the middle of that defense. Bolton has been highly productive despite not being, a tremendous athlete. And I think he's exactly what the Browns could look for to kind of solidify the middle of their defense. Now, here's one of my personal favorite picks in this mock draft, and that's going to be Rashad Bateman to the Baltimore Ravens. I think the Ravens kind of need to go the Bills route, how they built their receiving core to help Josh Allen with his accuracy issues. I think Bateman is a lot like Keenan Allen in the fact that he creates separation. He runs great routes. He's not the most like in the NFL now, we're getting very spoiled with like freak athletes at wide receiver and corner, whereas guys like, Stephon Diggs isn't like a freak athlete. Keenan Allen isn't a freak athlete, but they're two guys who know how to run routes and know how to get open. And I think that somebody like that who can create separation for Lamar Jackson will go a long way in helping his development, as opposed to just always targeting guys with, crazy amounts of speed. So Rashad Bateman to the Baltimore Ravens, help Lamar find another target who just gets open and Lamar can just hit him. Makes a ton of sense to me. Really, really like that pick. Next up, the Saints at 28. I have them taking Asante Samuel Jr. from Florida State. They're likely to lose Marcus Williams in free agency. Janoris Jenkins and Malcolm Jenkins are collecting AARP checks in the back end of their defense. You have Marshawn Lattimore already there, who's going to need a contract soon. The Saints just don't have a way to pay everybody in the back end, so drafting a young guy like Asante Samuel makes a lot of sense. He's a little undersized, but I definitely think he has what it takes to play outside corner in the NFL, and even if that doesn't work out, you throw him in at slot. Slot corner is extremely valuable in today's NFL. They already have Chauncey Gardner-Johnson kind of as that tweener in-between guy. Then I think you have a very rock-solid secondary, all things considered. Next up, we have the Green Bay Packers, and all I have to say for this one is Rondale Moore, that's a slam dunk to the Green Bay Packers. Get Aaron Rodgers another weapon outside of Devontae Adams. I don't mean any disrespect to Allen Lazard or Big Bob Tunyon, but you need a little bit more explosiveness out of this passing game. Valdez-Scantling has proved that he is not reliable enough to be that legitimate number 2 receiver in this scheme. I think you bring in Rondale Moore, it opens up the playbook. You can do all sorts of things with him in the backfield, especially with losing Aaron Jones in all likelihood in free agency. You can play him in the backfield, you can play him in the slot, you can play him outside. Rondale Moore is a tough, strong, freak athlete at the wide receiver position. Kind of the antithesis to what we talked about with Rashad Bateman, but really like that, especially if Rodgers stays around for another year. And even if not, he would go a long way in helping Jordan Love develop as well. Next up, again, I would not do this, but the Buffalo Bills had a lot of trouble running the ball later in the season, especially in the playoffs. This became evident. So Travis Etienne here at 30 to the Buffalo Bills doesn't make a ton of sense to me. If I was them, I would address the offensive line to strengthen my running game, but I can see how teams kind of sell themselves off. If we just find the right running back, it'll solve itself. I don't necessarily agree, but I understand the line of thinking. Travis Etienne, Buffalo, now you're talking about literally one of the deepest offenses in terms of skill talent position in the NFL. Gives you a little bit more leeway with what you can do with Devin Singletary and Zach Moss. Really like that pick. I not really like it, but I could see them talking themselves into it. 31, this doesn't really matter which order 31 and 32 are picking. I have the Chiefs going with Elijah Vera Tucker, the guard/tackle kind of out of USC. They need offensive line help. Vera Tucker could start for them at guard immediately and eventually transition to right tackle when Mitchell Schwartz retires, whenever that might be at this rate. But they need to really patch up that offensive line because it's been obvious watching this year how thin they are at that position and just how badly they need to kind of reshuffle the deck there and creep back more towards average, as Steve Palazzolo would like to say. Because as wonderful as Mahomes is in escaping pressure and throwing on the move, you don't want it to become too much of a habit or too much of a necessity for him to do that to be successful. And finally, at 32 overall, I hope this happens so my buddy Chris Hargrove will be happy that his team won the Super Bowl. But the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, if they're coming off a Super Bowl, I think Carlos Basham Jr. from Wake Forest makes a ton of sense here. He's a big edge, like, and when I mean big, I mean like beefy. He's going to push the pocket with Vita Vea. They might not be able to keep Shaquille Barrett in the offseason when he hits free agency, especially considering they're probably going to have to give money to Levante David. They're pretty set on offense in terms of skill position players, and the offensive line is one of the best in the NFL. So why not take a shot on a huge edge rushing prospect with a lot of upside in Carlos Basham Jr.? Look at this. So let's see what they gave me for my grade. An A- according to PFF. So recap, we got Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson, Devontae Smith, Justin Fields, Penei Sewell in the top 5. Some highlights, Trey Lance going at 9 to the Denver Broncos. Christian Barmore at 17 to the Las Vegas Raiders. Kadarius Toney at 19. Mac Jones comes off at 20 to the Chicago Bears. Najee Harris, a running back, at 23 to the New York Jets. Rashad Bateman at 27 to the Baltimore Ravens. Rondale Moore to the Green Bay Packers, which again I think would be electric. Travis Etienne at 30, Elijah Vera Tucker at 31, and Carlos Basham Jr. at 32. Guys, if you like this video, I would appreciate you leaving a like and maybe even subscribing. Hoping to come with more with 2 videos a week, ranging from Call of Duty League, NFL, NBA, college football, anime content, so all those sorts of fun things. If any of that stuff interests you, I will be making videos on them here soon. Appreciate you watching if you made it this far, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.